what I really find exciting about convening on today's theme of haptics is also that I feel like in some ways it's sort of branching on from the last month's symposium theme, which was the politics and poetics of care. So I feel like, there is definitely some overlap, and I'm really excited for that. And I think it's really interesting to see how even though we meet on different themes, I think we can try to create some linkages between them. And so let's see what happens in today's session. All right, so I think we can start with the presentation. So we'll start with Carolina, and then we'll have Najah and Ran and Laura. All right, so Carolina, are you ready to start?
Thank you guys for being here and invite me. I will share my slides, and I will put, you can see? No,
Yes.
No, again. Okay, now it's there. Well, I will introduce myself. I think I define myself as a multidisciplinary artist and researcher who actually use textiles. My MA was in textiles, but I understand textile as this web of connection that is embodied between land, climate change, and bodies. So during the MA, I explore different ways to connect textile with sensorial register. For example, mapping sounds, or embody notation, or proposing a garment that actually is activated by certain environments. So in that sense, I think I understand textiles as this interface that connect human to an intercultural perspective, where the material, as you see in the graphic, is this connection between myth and technology. By basically the way that I work is based on holistic perspective, which seeks to embody indigenous knowledge. But today I will talk more about my project Haptic Imagination. It's basically seeing touching as media, because I understand touching as this tactile interaction that spread a lot of emotion and memory, but also can create this immediacy and intimacy with not just other materials, but also with other objects and other landscapes and other cultural thinking. In that sense, I think that this is embodied in the Andean textiles. She's, for example, a thinker and a writer, Elvira Espejo, who actually points out aloud. She says like a touch allows the material to get into the body. And for me, this is very important because she emphasized that certain cognitive skills brought by Western culture to Latin American territories, such as writing, actually had reduced other kind of sensorial capacities. She explained it that way. For example, in the Andes, the weavers need to touch a lot different materials in order to recognize them. And she points out this, for example, they by touch can recognize the softest fibers for the garments that will stand close to the body. So I think that part is quite important because that means that in the Andes has another responsiveness in the haptic sensitivity, and actually how human body perceive reality through the senses, and incorporating in this kind of knowledge through haptic experience. So in the same line, I start to study this tattoo, the traditional tattoo, that is one of the oldest technique, and how we can understand that as a haptic interface. For a weaver, we can see, for example, the traditional tattoo is this kind of register or interaction where the needle impressing of the skin leaves this kind of scars. But this is one part, really important part of the sensorial experience. And in order to amplify this experience, I use gravity sketch in order to create this lengthened version of this experience. No? And it provides this kind of perception of sentience, that someone who actually is able to feeling. But tattoo also could be read as a semi-writing. And the semi-writing is one kind of particular type of notational scheme, because a semi-writing doesn't have any semiotic meaning. So on the left, you can see different kind of examples of this. Meanwhile, on the right, there are some drawings that I did based on the tattoos, based on tattoos mummies that I found it. But both are like this kind of visual system who actually carry on a lot of rhythm, alliteration, symmetry. And I think that this kind of proposition or graphic proposition associated with gestural lines can carry on this kind of desire for graphic expression. So in itself can be a kind of language, can I letters or post-linguistic or pre-linguistic writings. But obviously, up to now, we don't know what actually means a tattoo. And even though it was written, we are not able to understand it. But for example, that helped me a lot. The Roland Barthes says, the nuns, that actually the myth is a type of speech chosen by history. It cannot possibly evolve from the nature of things. A speech of this kind is a message. So I think this actually highlight the presence of other kind of cultures that actually evolve other kind of language. In the case of the mummy, I think that it's not about what it means. It's more about the performative use of this graphic notation on the body. And I think tattoo as a semi-writing can help us to understand the body as an object. And I think this can produce this connection with nature. For example, if I am applying this tattoo on this wood surface, we can understand that it's more as a decoration. But if we see it more as a, I don't know, like a symbolic abstraction, we can imagine them as a language. So it depends about the displacement of context. After all this research about this, the tactile effect and the language, I start to think how can I incorporate this traditional technique into more fluid or into more in order to discuss these contemporary problems that I see that happen. No? That is why I propose this project, Writing of Lost Bodies. And actually it's a robotic arm based on this tattoo that I found in mummified arms. And this robotic arm produced this movement into the surface that connect us into the human rights. In order to clarify more and put in context this project, I will put this video. I think you can.
The Amazon rainforest is vital to regulate the planet's ecosystem. The Amazon is also home to 2 million indigenous people. Her name is Olivia Arevalo Lomas, an 81-year-old indigenous leader of the Shipibo-Conibo community. Olivia was a healer and active defender of the cultural and environment rights for her people. In this recording, she's singing an icaro, a sacred song from the Amazon. This image shows the tag to the Yanomami people in Palimi, a village located in Brazil. The villagers are running to protect from a shooting coming from a miner's boat, which was crossing the Aricoera River. These systematic attacks against the communities who resist to leave their land, force their displacement, and threaten indigenous leaders. The data from Human Rights Defender Memorial events information of the victims, such as geographical location, gender, condition of the victims, among others. The majority were killed while protecting their lands, which represent millenary environmental rights of their people. This is linked to the fact that at least 331 human rights defenders of the Amazon were murdered in 2020.
Okay. And this is the context where I developed this robotic arm. And actually, this is the mimicking human touching, and is derived by this database for the number of people who were killed. And actually, it's this transition between how, for me, what means this tattoo as information, and we can use and use it into the modern technology. So I think that this is an extension of the tattoo that did it, how it works tattoo in the past. We can use it and we can make ourselves involved with this kind of problems that actually are global issues. And I think it's everything. And this is the video. I think this is everything.
Yeah, thanks, Carolina. I'm gonna
Thank you.
go next. Oh, this is my first slide. Can you see it? And also, how do I play it so that it's not, okay, I'm just gonna do this and let's hope it doesn't move on its own. Yeah, so this is not a very good picture to start with, maybe because it's not my work, but it's a picture I found which I feel like represents my practice in other ways. But I'm going to talk about very specifically this one string of my practice, which is more connected to the theme today. And so I've got this interesting fact about our sense of touch. So by week 8, we can feel touch, and that's actually only 5 weeks of existence, really, because they count pregnancy from like a different, from like the first day of the period or something. So that's only 5 weeks old fetus, apparently, and it can feel touch. And it's supposed to be the most important sense in the human baby as well when it's born. Anyway, so the beginning of my sort of, I guess, when I started becoming interested in haptics or this touchy-feely side of things, I think it came out in this writing form, like written form. And so this is something I wrote many years ago, actually. And if I read it out to you, the organism formed by the organs of 2 bodies prematurely emerges from one to become public. New bodies reconnect themselves to their parent to survive. We are still attached, and the limit of our bodies is temporarily extended to the joining of bodies via the touching of the skin. Much like the volume of the chest, the skin, as a limit of the body or bodies, expands and contracts. The organism moves. A body will collide, connect, and correlate with another. 2 bodies will brush past, look at, or touch each other. We will reattach by random movements, calculated or thoughtful or unintentional or affectionate or whatever movements, seeking closeness and the natural state. So I had a sort of interest in the beginning and end of life and body and the skin as like a limit of the body. And what really was going on around this time in my practice was these like swimming sessions I would go on with other artists. And I guess the conversation we were having was this feeling of being in water and how it felt like the limit of your body was extended to all the water around you. And I don't know, this was a thought that was going on at the time. So this is really bad chronology, by the way, because the influence that Bataille had in my work came way after, but it's so closely connected to these earlier ideas or interests that I had that I put it in this part of the presentation. But, this is like jumping from 2018 to maybe 2021. So I started becoming interested in Bataille when I was at the RCA doing the contemporary art practice program, and sort of I went into the program saying I really wanted to write my dissertation about violence and sexuality and how I thought these two must be connected. And then I think the tutor I got, he just said something really weird. He said that my proposal was a primordial scene in a cosmic setting. And that really stuck with me because I didn't really know what it meant. But anyway, he went on to say that I should read Bataille, and then I got lost in this kind of reading. He's really not such a good like reference, I feel, because like a lot of the stuff he says doesn't really make any sense, and then you have to kind of read around him a lot and understand that he just really liked Nietzsche and stuff. But anyway, so this quote says, "A violent death disrupts the creature's discontinuity. What remains, what the tense onlookers experience in the succeeding silence, is the continuity of all existence with which the victim is now one." This quote from the introduction, eroticism is giving a definition for the word sacred. For Bataille, the sacred sacrifice in the witnessing of a violent death reveals continuity, and he further argues that eroticism has the capacity to reveal continuity as well. Eroticism opens the way to death. Death opens the way to the denial of our individual lives. The transgressions of taboos also belong to the realm of the sacred. The mysticism and emphasis here on sacrifice presents itself as an alternative way of making sense of violence or its purpose in society. I wrote sort of at the end, this is, by the way, taken from my dissertation, that I wrote sort of at the end, "I do not fully understand or agree with this particular stance, but nevertheless provides a curious possibility," because I felt like he was creating this idea that like violence is maybe necessary or part of just existence, coming from this necessity to sacrifice from the excesses that we produce in society. But anyway, let's move on. So this is like, again, jumping years and years. So maybe some of you saw my performance at the RCA of The Unholy Woman. That was actually something I did as like second time. The first time it happened was actually, I think, 2019. I was doing this Tate exchange, and I was in this bin bag, and I was sort of, I didn't know about Bataille at this point, by the way, but I was just sort of thinking a lot about hiding the body and sexuality and these things. And particularly, I think on my mind, I was thinking that if I want to be performing as a Muslim artist, like, you know, I felt a bit, I guess, I was quite young. I felt a bit scared, like, I don't want this to be on the internet and my whole entire family pointing and saying, "Oh, Najah, you know, what is this weird shit you do?" And so, so I guess, like, I thought if I just covered myself or I hide away, it's fine. And so I would make a tent, or I made these tents and I covered my body, and I would explore kind of like being half of a body. And there was different references for this. There was all this foot stuff, like what if I was an artist who was just feet? You know, at that point you can't even identify me, so like, you know, would I get in trouble then? And then there's also this thought I had about something I read when it came to kind of like cultures in the Middle East, where the idea was that you don't look directly at women. If you're a man, you look kind of, you lower your gaze. It's kind of like Islamic concept, I suppose, but I think it's quite prevalent in South Asia as well. But the idea is you kind of lower your gaze, and then when you do lower your gaze, you know, what do? Is you see the feet. And I was reading this really strange text about how these Saudi men developed like a foot fetish just from always lowering their gaze. And so this all kind of like became, oh, whoa. Anyway, this is another point of reference, which was really important to me. My favorite film, Pakiza, and this is probably like where it kind of started. And this was also not in chronological order. This was like way earlier, before I did any foot stuff. And this is just some text I stole from the Juggernaut, which I paid for. You know, I subscribed to that just to get this. But but yeah, I'm not going to read that. But there is this, I guess, famous line where he says, I saw your feet, they're very lovely, don't put them on the floor, they'll get dirty. But you know, the guy doesn't know that this woman is a dancer and she does put her bare feet on the floor and dance. I don't want to ruin the film for anyone who wants to watch it, but it's my favorite film. So then my sort of practice of what if an artist was just 2 feet extended to, well, then what if that practice had its own practice? What if this kind of supposed artist who's just feet had its own practice of drawing and so on? So these are the really earlier, actually these aren't the earliest ones. Before this, I was, you know, hiding in a tent making really horrible paintings, which was so bad I would never show them to anybody. But I was doing it with my feet. And so this is also something I've drawn with my feet or written with my feet. And at the beginning, I was really thinking that painting and drawing with your feet was really important, because I was thinking so much about like this woman who has to hide from, like, you know, men in this like really weird society, or I have to hide myself from just a pair of feet. Like she wouldn't draw the way I was drawing, which was, I thought, a very kind of like a Western way of drawing. And so in my mind, I had to unlearn drawing by trying to draw with my feet, and my feet weren't kind of, they didn't have this habit of making lines in a certain way or drawing in a certain way. And so I felt like I was doing something, basically. This is more drawings, and then this is one of the most recent ones. And yeah, I think that's it. That's my 10 minutes as well. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you, Najah.
Did I see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So hi everyone, I'm Ran. It's been an honor to join the Critical Symposium for the second time, and thank you to everyone for starting our meeting earlier. So for today's sharing, I'd like to just jump into a 4-minute video that I made for a collaborative event of CAP and Tate Modern Lace in March. I feel like it may be more powerful to watch the piece instead of me just explaining it right away. So well, let me stop and share the sound. There we go. Sorry, it's on pause for no reason. Okay, I'll stop share and get back to my PowerPoint. Okay, so a century ago, there's a British art critic by the name of Cliff Bell attempted to explain what makes art art. And he postulated that there's a significant form, which is like a distinct set of lines, colors, textures, and shapes that qualifies a given work as art. And these aesthetic qualities trigger a pleasing response in the viewer, and that response, he argued, is universal no matter where or when that viewer lives. So here comes to the first question, a really broad question that I propose here is that, do our brains find certain shapes or textures more attractive than others? And then based on this general question, I would like to throw another 3 questions that I've been exploring with my practice as the focus, which is, why do we find what is smooth beautiful today? And is beauty only found in smoothness? And what does this do with things that are not smooth? So for this sharing, I will be referencing a lot from cultural theories called Byung-Chul Han's book called Saving Beauty, which heavily influenced my art practice. In this book, Han went against the contemporary notions of smooth, the airbrushed beauty, and he interrogates our preoccupation with all things slick and smooth, and how such beauty is associated with truth, temptations, and even disasters. In the book, Han started directly with quote unquote, the smooth is the signature of the present time. It connects the sculptures of Jeff Koons, iPhones, and Brazilian waxing. Then why do we today find what is smooth beautiful? And also beyond its aesthetic effect, it reflects a general social imperative, embodies today's society of positivity. What is smooth does not injure, and it does not offer any resistance. Any form of negativity is removed. And I will unpack this statement a little bit more. The aesthetic of the smooth can be seen in the contemporary design of electronics. For example, the LG G Flex phone is even covered with a self-healing skin, which makes any scratch, that is like any trace of injury, disappear within the shortest of time. It's invulnerable, so to speak. And the artificial skin of the smartphone keeps it smooth at all times. Such absence of resistance are essential characteristics of the aesthetics of the smooth. And also Jeff Koons, famous for his sculptures with smooth surfaces. Andy Warhol also professed his commitment to beautiful, smooth skins, surfaces, but his art still have the negativity of death and disaster inscribed into it. And his surfaces are not entirely smooth. But in Jeff Koons' works, there is no disaster, no injury, no ruptures, also no seams. Everything appears rounded, polished, and smoothed out. Koons says that an observer of his works should only emit a simple wow. It seems that his art does not require any judgment, no reflection or thought. And in this way, his smooth sculptures cause a haptic compulsion to touch them, even the desire to suck them. His work lacks the negativity that would demand distance. It is the positivity of smoothness alone that causes the haptic compulsion and invites the observer to take an attitude without distance to touch. And for Roland Barthes, the sense of touch is, quote unquote, the most demystifying of all sense, unlike sight, which is the most magical. The sense of sight keeps a distance, while the sense of touch destroys it. Without distance, there can be no mysticism. Demystification lets everything become available for enjoyment and consumption. The sense of touch destroys the negativity of what is wholly other, and it secularizes what it touches. In contrast to the sense of sight, touch is incapable of wonderment. The smooth touch screen, therefore, is a place of demystification and total consumption, and produces what one likes. So does Jeff Koons' sculptures. Another example is the Brazilian waxing, which makes the body smooth. It represents today's compulsive hygiene. For most of us, the closest we ever come to disgust is in a failure of proper hygiene. The waxed skin gives the body a pornographic smoothness, which is felt to be pure and clean. Today's society, as Han claimed in his book, obsessed with cleanness and hygiene, is a society of positivity which feels disgust at any kind of negativity. From the perspective of hygiene reason, any ambivalence and any secret are also perceived to be dirty. Pure is transparency, and things become transparent when they fit into the smooth streams of information and data. In this way, data have something pornographic and obscene about them. And get back to my own practice within such a framework. In the video that I showed in the beginning, it started with a very close-up shot of machine touching the straight metal tube with relatively smooth surface. And as the camera slowly pushes further, the tube has also been bent to an irregular, twisted, and even broken shape. In a close-up, the subject appears to be pornographic. For Jane Baudrillard, any picture, any form, any part of the body looked at from a close distance is a sexual organ. So there's an obscure transition in this video on the distance between the audience and the subject matter. By distance, I mean both physically and psychologically. It became physically further, at the same time, less smooth and touchable. For me, this work is like a kind of an experimental demo for me to play with ideas of pornography, of touch, of machine, of body and gaze. And the last piece of slide is I've been working with rusty, twisted, and smooth metal surface for recently as a completely opposite side of the beauty of smoothness. Anti-smoothness is like a methodology of mine to discuss my post-COVID reflections on aging, disease, and the pharmacopornographic body. I'm hoping to expose the negativity more, the wound, which I oppose to the positivity of the smooth. Yeah, that's my share for today. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ran.
Thank you. So it's me next, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you everyone so far. It's been really inspiring and really great. The depth of like research as well, and listening to all these different perspectives. So yeah, it's been brilliant. So I will share my screen. I'm going to try and also share my sound as well. Great. I think I've done it, and then I'm going to. Okay, so for today, I'm going to sort of touch upon a few projects that, or a few outputs from my general kind of research theme that I've been looking at in the last sort of, I guess the journey has been 2 years, but in sort of the last year, I've really sort of defined more and more, and still defining the kind of area. And I thought it'd be interesting just to sort of touch upon a few different outputs I've been exploring that overlaps with this idea of haptics, which is fascinating. And I just find it's really interesting in work in general when sort of exploring the other senses, I think, is so important. We're sort of always led, normally led sort of with that kind of visual or even like sonic elements, and it's really interesting, like these other senses, and thinking about the kind of hierarchy we tend to put on them, which yeah, does something interesting. So my work, I've given it the title Sonic Contamination, and it stems mainly from this sort of quote that really inspired a lot of the conceptual stuff of my work from Anna Singh's book The Mushroom at the End of the World. So what she talks about with the term contamination as kind of looking at as this verb that actually has a more positive sense of describing a way of collaboration, of thinking of like development of relationships from the human to non-human, and I kind of like kind of against the idea of capitalism, thinking more like horizontal plane of progression rather than this kind of if you're thinking of that way, kind of this like onward vertical plane of progression. And other sort of research areas I'm really excited by, the idea of bridging between different beings that exist on different scales of time. So that kind of came from a quite early on reading by Carlo Rovelli, where he talks about time and legion. So every kind of place, every species, every point, every human, every non-human has its own scale of time. And I thought that was quite inspiring, how, you know, trying to link relationally between different beings, how we can kind of empathize by understanding the idea that we are all on our own scale of time. So, you know, thinking of ways we can bridge between these, and the kind of my method that I've been using is I sort of kind of rhizomatic, so trying to understand these different outputs that I've been doing has helped me sort of gain sort of deeper understanding of the sort of area that I'm interested in, which primarily comes from listening, and I'm sort of excited about trying to bridge to these other like beings that we don't normally hear, and specifically looking at like the micro world. So when we think of contamination, we're thinking of like bacterial relationships and like how we move through spaces. That these relationships that happen on this micro scale are occurring all the time, and the idea of sort of boundaries between beings are much more blurred when we get to that kind of micro, the tiny, the small. And it's interesting thinking in the way of sound, because everything is constantly vibrating, even on like the molecular level, that everything is sort of is vibrating and has that kind of energy, which is really interesting thinking on haptics. And so when I was trying to sort of bridge to these beings, and then kind of, you know, the end goal is to go really micro, I started exploring doing these workshops. So I had like these different processes really stemming from Pauline Oliveros's sonic meditations, and Hildegard's inner listening. So crucially, I wanted to go through these different methods without using microphones, so just being in spaces and listening, and then using my extended field recording techniques. I would connect contact mics which pick up these micro vibrations and would reveal these sort of worlds of sounds we don't normally hear, and then getting people to go through different exercises to help them sort of understand and have that kind of level of care of empathy. So this is just a little extract from one of the elements in my workshop. This is phase 2, when you've linked the contact mics. Okay, so there you saw lots of like different experiments with I think also feeling like our presence in these spaces. So you can hear these like tiny micro sounds, but what was really fascinating is like actually there in the space as we move, we realize like we're these enormous beings, and just having like these experiences of the kind of micro vibrational when you're touching and moving, and also just sitting and listening and trying to sort of comprehend the kind of vast spectrum of time and I guess presence in the space. So I also did different participation with groups of people, which was really interesting. And I think one of the great things about listening to these micro vibrations and feeling like our own, I guess, presence in the way is the discussions that we had together in kind of comparing the different sites, and also this new perspective of these environments that we were kind of coming across. And I got participants to sort of fill out, and they didn't have to write, they didn't have to draw, but it was sort of like expressing how did they sort of see themselves in these like micro environments after having these listening kind of vibrational experiences. So this is them doing the kind of collective contamination. And what was really interesting is that idea of touch and breath, and like sonically hearing the impact of these things. And it was like interesting because obviously we move through these spaces, but when you're listening to it, you're just so painfully aware of like how much of a presence we hold. So yeah, that was one of the outputs that I was sort of exploring. So then with the kind of field recordings that I was collecting, this is just a kind of sonic meditation experience that I put together, was also kind of, it was really tough actually trying to take people away from like the live spaces themselves, and seeing if there was a way to also still get people to think about bridging and collectively listening. So this is just some snaps from a sonic meditation. I guess it was kind of like a performance. So we had non-human entities there with us as well, listening to the sounds. And then we had some sort of close-up visuals from the sites that I did sort of these field recordings from. And then I got a little extract that you can have a little listen to. Very sorry, I'm going to cut it short just for time. But those sounds were a collection of ones from in the earth in these sites around Epping Forest, which is where I was doing my workshops, and these visuals are from there as well. And the sounds were a mixture of long form recordings of forming mycelium in a bag over a long period of time, those kind of clicks and pops, so that's sort of like changing water in the sort of environment, and air pressure, and then all these like insects and like living beings that exist in these worlds, you know, transmitting their own information and communication through these like micro vibrations, which come alive for us once we can like, you know, attach these contact mics. And that's, you know, just a fraction of what they're communicating. So haptics, the installation piece that I created sort of from this experiences and research, I called Sonic Biome. So this is a kind of a bed that as you touch and feel the surface, it triggers this polyphonic audio vibrational piece. So I think I've got a little video here just to show you how it works. So it uses conductive thread, but I'll go into a little bit more detail in a second. Okay. Okay, so again. So it's what was really interesting. It was like kind of taking all of these ideas of sitting in spaces, but most importantly, the idea of touch and using textiles as this like really interesting conduit to help like wider audiences kind of engage that idea of contamination and like these micro worlds and how like we leave traces in the spaces around us, but feeling comfortable with the idea of interacting and touching sort of these surfaces and thinking about something that sometimes people find quite hard to engage with, because when we sort of talk about bacteria, it can feel quite like a negative thing in certain respects when you're actually getting people to engage, to like, no, touch this surface, to understand about these themes, as opposed to other methods. So textile was really a really great and interesting conduit to explore with sound. So the textile itself, I sort of used forage material from the site to create this kind of trace bundle dyed texture, which was really interesting. Again, kind of getting these traces from these beings. And then using conductive thread as a way that when they touch the surface again, they could trigger these different audio worlds. And these audio worlds were the field recordings that I'd been collecting during these workshops of listening. And then here you can see what is underneath the bed. So there are these transducers, and as you attach them to a surface, the vibrations from the audio data is being fed into the surface, so it turns it into a speaker. And what was really exciting is exploring kind of the spatiality of sound, as well as the kind of haptic, the feeling, the touch. So as they're touching, they're not only hearing this interaction, they're feeling that kind of vibrational feedback to their action. And yeah, I don't know if I've run out of time, but this is another project that uses that kind of idea of haptics to sort of draw across quite I guess complex ideas of communication and data exchanges in forests, and it was quite an interesting project to work on in this team. But again, this uses that kind of conductive thread technology to sort of you get them sort of to touch and explore this sculpture, and you get this like instant sonic response. So this was all about mycorrhizal connections in forests. So fungi creates this mycelium network under our normally organic settings, and through the connection from root tip to the mycelium network, this is called a mycorrhizal connection, data and chemical nutrients can be shared. And it's really, you know, we're just starting to kind of comprehend and come to grips of like the way that these vast forests of communication can occur through these connections. And so we wanted to sort of create this haptic response to get people to think about their own sort of ways of connecting to these environments. And I'm going to stop there because I feel like I've been talking for too long. So thank you for listening. And again, yeah, everyone, it's quite fortunate to go last because I just really inspired by everyone else to sort of root us on. So thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone.
I think like all four of you had like really amazing and rich presentations. So I think and I find there's so many like overlaps between all of your different works, which is really interesting and exciting. So I think we have 1 hour left, so we can have like, you know, a very informal discussion, and like our participants, if they want to, you know, like engage, please feel free. You know, there's really not much formalities. This is just a space to just, you know, explore, you know, just test out ideas. I don't know if any of you have any, like, want to start off. I mean, if you want to start off, yeah, Najah shared something on.
No, I just wrote about some books.
Okay.
Writings,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's great references. Thank you. We'll definitely look into it.
Yeah, I like Byung-Chul Han, by the way.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. I'm
Wow.
reading this book right now, like the what is it called? Repulsion of the Other, or something like that. Expulsion of the Other.
Oh yeah, that's one of the series
Yeah.
of his book. Yeah.
He writes about
Basically,
terrorism. He writes about terrorism in that book quite a lot. And that's kind of
ooh,
what I'm interested. I'm reading about that.
nice. Thank you. Also, I do have a little practical question that I'm interested to ask Najah, because I really love like your performance idea. Is that a performance or just drawing piece that you draw with your feet? And you mentioned that unlearn drawing and drawing in a certain way, and also how it relates to your the lower gaze and foot fetish. I wonder how the whole work could develop in the future.
Are you asking whether it's a performance or not? But it also, I mean, I kind of
Mhm.
also saw it becoming potentially a workshop of like unlearning drawing or something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
if so, I would really want to participate actually.
Yeah, it's fun. It's fun, I think, because I think I was thinking for a very long time leading up to that point separately in my own drawing and painting sort of stuff that
Mhm.
because I haven't been consistently drawing and painting. And I think like for a while I was just thinking that I'm sick of this because it feels a lot like I'm just making like this artwork which is derived from like the fact that I've been taught drawing in a very particular way, you know, in a kind of like very Eurocentric drawing tradition kind of route. And so
Mhm.
for a while I just wasn't drawing at all. I really hated it because I just thought, oh, it doesn't feel right. But then yeah, when I started drawing my feet, it felt more like maybe this is something else. Yeah, maybe I don't know. Um, it's an interesting connection to have as well, like with drawing when you're with your feet, because you're really far away from the piece of paper or whatever you're drawing on, and you're also walking all over your work. Like if you're standing, well, I was doing a lot of stuff seated, but if I'm standing while drawing, which is what I do for larger work, you do have this strange feeling of walking on top of your work, which feels really like awkward because like I mean, I think I don't know about you, but I'm used to kind of really protecting the paper from stuff. But in
Mhm.
this circumstance, I kind of just have to like let it be vulnerable to the environment as well. Like I've have so many water splashes from washing my hands and splashing onto my work on while walking past it. Stuff like this. Um
Yeah, self-sabotage.
yeah, lots of it. There's lots of like if you when you're drawing with your feet, you don't actually have very good control of the line. So what ends up happening is like you totally lose control of that of line where it goes, and there's this feeling of I don't know what the word is like. I guess it's like a process of accepting your flaws or like accepting the flaws that are created or and it's quite relaxing to go through this. It's like almost like I don't care anymore about actually drawing what I and making it look like what I'm drawing. This is it, it's just kind of about this how much I can do.
Mhm.
I also wonder, like, do you usually draw with your hand? Like, or have you completely stopped drawing using your hand?
No, I do
Uh,
both now, but I think drawing with my feet allowed me to get back into drawing as a practice. I wasn't drawing and painting for like maybe 3 or 4 years.
mhm.
Pretty much as soon as I came into uni, I stopped making work that was drawing and painting. And then I kind of really got into it my last year of my BA from this route. Yeah.
I also wonder too, like if there are some other differences between drawing with hand and versus drawing with feet that, like, that you have understood, picked up on.
Um, like I said, drawing with your hands, if you've been training to draw from the age of like 5 or 6, which is what I've been doing, or like it feels very much like your hand has a kind of muscle memory, it already knows what to do, and a lot of the lines are going to be something that's just been, beaten into your like brain. And then it almost feels like you can feel the way the information going to your finger and your hand and then back into your brain is is so different compared to holding a pen with your foot. It just feels like, you know, so much less control, and you can't do it quite right. It feels like slower as well. Everything feels so much slower. Maybe like it's just further away. You know, all these information have to go through the nerves and come back up. It's yeah, it feels like delayed, but also just so awkward. And painful. Lots of cramps. Like we're not used to doing very, like, you know, having fine motor skills with your feet. So like you get loads of cramps doing this. It's so painful to go through this. Trying to actually complete a drawing is really tiresome. And you know, it can get quite irritating, but I enjoy it.
I was thinking like you know, in the last forum, one of the questions like we started off with was like, you know, just a general question, you know, what is an art-based research, and like how do you situate research within your practice? And so I mean, I'm really curious and excited to hear how each of you define artistic practice. And, you know, obviously research has a big influence within your practice, right? But I am really excited to hear how you situate that sort of the dynamics between practice and theory or research. I mean, I guess research is encompassing of all of that, but like how do you situate theory with practice? And so I'm just like really curious to hear how each of you understand artistic practice. So, or what is research within art practice?
For me, a simple way to say it is that research provides me a certain legitimacy to say something personal, to share something personal to the others, even because everyone has their own thought, own experience that they think really meaningful. But sometimes I would wonder if mine is worth to be discussed. And then to build a certain framework or put this into a certain framework, provide a common ground for so I'm working on research a lot. Yeah.
So in that case, like how do you define like what is research? What is the sort of research that you look out for?
For me, the first one is theoretical research, like what I have shared in the presentation. I feel like I have a certain connection to the anti-smoothness and all the metal surfaces, and how does this do with the whole post-COVID environment that I've been dealing with. That's the part that I need more research to make the whole discussion richer. And also another part of research I've been looking into is regarding my cultural histories and cultural identities. For example, I've been working on the research about the Chinese immigrants in Canada, and how does this deal with my sculptures and whole the histories. And then combine everything together, I can feel like my position within the gaps about among time and space and everything. I can feel my own position at the same time share with others. So that is something I feel like research is necessary for me. I'm not sure if you guys have the same feeling, but I need to, at this stage of my practice, I need research to ensure myself. But I think as time goes by, I would have something like more that I can stand alone more.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question to
think-
that. But yeah, I want to hear like, yeah,
Yes.
Carolina, go ahead.
No, I think it's a lovely jump, because as same as Ran, I think it's very important for me as well, the theory, but also I think it's quite important the sensorial experience that I have. For example, when I stimulate these haptic perceptions, or for example, with the research that I find, that she's a Bolivian, for example, she actually she did a lot of autoethnography, no? Because she comes from a specific community and she studied arts, but also she came from a family from weavers. So she gave her this kind of openness to certain communities that actually people who don't manage the same language or certain habits, it's not very easy for them to get into that community. So I think this kind of research is something really important for me, that this kind of experience that they accumulate. And I think in my case as well, I think in some stage I use a lot autoethnography as well, and expose for example, in one of my first projects, I did this mapping of sound, and I tried to collect data from different urban areas around St. Paul's Cathedral. So I think that this experience of this kind of research experiment or whatever, I think it helps me. It gives me other kind of input in order to see my work in another level. At the same, I think, I don't know, maybe at the same level. Up to now, I start to think about this, but it's quite important as the theory is that it's at the same how I choose as well, because my background, for example, is in arts, but I choose textiles. So I think in one point I mix this making, I think, and thinking theory. So I think there are different levels.
Kind of coming off from that, I think it's really, it's like really, really important having research for me personally at the basis of my work. I guess my work, I feel, are sort of responses of me and I guess collectively from the workshops, of trying to kind of comprehend or come to terms with sort of what they're trying, what these sort of concepts and ideas or research are sort of putting across, and trying to get kind of like a deeper understanding of it, and sort of how does my identity hold with it, or not just my own individual identity, kind of collective identity within the universe, which I know sounds quite vast and quite a grandiose thing to say, but a lot of what kind of led me on different routes in my own kind of freely led research was this kind of apathy to all things, and then actually in this sort of acceptance deconstruction of sort of the meaning of where it exists in the universe, like we're such tiny insignificant kind of beings, but actually in that feeling quite free from that and sort of wanting to celebrate that fact, kind of sort of indicated. But the kind of the research that has been in the way the most influential to work is the kind of primary research with people, bringing people on board in sort of collectively trying to come to terms with different ideas, and the discussion like what we're having today as well, like kind of these discussions I think are the most influential personally for me in the different outputs that I do, because it's kind of how we kind of comprehend collectively different ideas helps inform, I guess for me it helps inform the work that I feel reaches the most audiences. And I'm not saying that means that's better or worse work, but I guess as a practice, trying to kind of communicate complex and things that even I find hard to, like I'm still understanding and wrapping my head around, creating experiences that allow wide audiences to sort of connect to it, I feel are the most sort of impactful, that, you know, for me personally in making. But yeah, I guess it's just the kind of research I've been personally looking at. Maybe that's where I've got that perspective from, and it might change from different topics and research. But yeah.
I guess is Ron leaving?
She said she's leaving for 5.
Okay, yeah, all right. Just to kind of go over what you guys have already said. I do see this kind of legitimizing yourself through research. It's like a funny one, because I think personally I maybe was vaguely interested in like surrealism and maybe like Foucault, and read a bit, but then I feel like a lot of the decisions I've made with my art practice have been so intuitive, and then I very deliberately avoided writing my BA dissertation like kind of connected to what I was doing maybe artistically, because I kind of didn't really, I don't know, I didn't really want to have this sort of researchy practice. It became very much this way recently though, especially at the RCA. And I think this came from this feeling that I felt like you really have to know where you are in the context like of other art that's being made and has been made in the past. If you kind of want to, if you really want to, I think personally, if you really want to kind of make the correct decisions with your practice, the best thing to do is know exactly what everybody else who's come before you, who's tried to tackle the same question or the same idea, has done. And to do that, you have to do so much research. Like that is so much research, because then you have to not only try to look at other people's practices, but understand why they make work the way they did, and go through all this research that they've done. So that's where I feel like it's really necessary for artists to like really know where they stand, like contextualize themselves, but also I think that artists should be academic now these days. I feel like so much creative stuff is just brainless and brain dead, and it's worrying, in culture, how much of this creative stuff has not much thought behind it. So that's my other point, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, in the last forum, I was asking about the validity of research, because I'm more, I tend to go more towards academic sort of research, like personally. So and I remember Alice Harris saying something about like the way she defines research is as gathering, where what she was trying to say was the practice itself becomes a site of research rather than just looking at, Ran, you were saying, you use the word legitimacy of the of your own subjectivities, let's say. And I wonder to what extent, like, again, how you go about choosing, this aspect of legitimacy, because I feel like a lot of the philosophers, let's say, maybe, I feel like it still gets infiltrated with their own subjectivities to an extent. And I think that's what, certain post-colonialist theorists, such as Gayatri Spivak, talks in her book, A Critique of Post-Colonial Reason, where she talks about Eurocentric philosophers. It's sort of hard to sort of take out their philosophies from their own subjectivities. So I really wonder, like, how you think about the idea of legitimacy, and also like how you go about choosing that, your own like subjectivities, right? Like, how do you choose the sources, and also like how do you also look at your own practice as a form of research, right? As a site of research, as a site of knowledge production, which in turn can be used to maybe expand upon the other research that you might be looking upon. And I really wonder, because I really wonder about that. And what do you have understood about that, from about the research from your own like practice?
That's a really broad question to think about. Yeah. For me, I chose the word legitimacy. Is that it is true that Eurocentric, Western-centric, in fact, contemporary art art itself is a term invented by the West. And we are now in this game, and we have to sort of know the rules to fit ourselves in, and then based on that to say something that we really want to say. There is some overlapping in that, but to be honest, for me, this is just the start to legitimize myself and then do something different. If that is that too obvious or where to say that, but I do believe so.
No, I think that's totally fine. I think it's about like understanding, right? I mean, it's a growth, right? We keep developing our own brain. It's not like you reach a point and then you stop thinking about research. I think especially with creative practices, you know, it keeps generating or contributing towards understanding of research. Yeah, not just your own understanding about research, but I think, you know, just informs. Yeah.
I just wanted to add to what you said, Ran. A lot of the times I think people don't know what they're doing, but I mean, if they're reading, they might be influenced by what they're reading without knowing that they're being influenced by it. So I've noticed that I've experienced moments where there's a giant gap between what I'm doing, how much it's influenced, and how I'm aware of what I'm being influenced by. And so even if you think, I don't know, that your work isn't being influenced by what you're reading, it kind of almost always is. I found that because I've tried to avoid, I don't know, I tried to avoid like marrying my research to my art practice. I thought I wanted to do those two things separately. I wanted to do research separately and write about stuff that I cared about as well as my art practice. But then it will somehow do something to your brain, especially like really complicated texts, which I feel like you do engage with.
Yeah, agree. You will be influenced by what you have read, what you have experienced anyway. Yeah, it doesn't mean that I have to use my work to illustrate my theories, but yeah, I agree.
I was just very curious about like you know, that you show the film like, you know, everything is a sexual organ. And you had the video, and I was really wondering like how through the making of that work you understood about like what you understood about that through the making of that work. Like, is there something that you understood about, you know, the
Yeah, the
elements of
work
it?
yeah, I named that work. It's not a completed work though. I named that a called a porn. Because for me, so to clear the definition of pornographic is that it's like showing or describing naked people or sex in a very open and direct way in order to cause sexual excitement. And then in the video, or I'm just, my thought is wandering. I'll just come up with what I have thought at the moment. When I used to say that data or information is somehow pornographic and obscene, I was meaning that they have no insight, no flip sides. They are not ambiguous, and they differ from language, which does not permit things to come into perfectly clear focus. And data and information deliver themselves to total visibility, and they make everything visible. And such pure visibility, it diminishes distance, and such kind of absence of distance is pornographic for me. And also, so it's a kind of in the same situation that in contemporary films or in my little demo film, that the things are shown in a close up. Everything's visible. You cannot, it's so close up that there's no depth. Everything is just in front of you. And the whole body or the whole subject matter itself appears to be a porn. If I'm not sure if that makes sense.
Also, I found some like sort of like relation between what Laura was saying about contamination, like how you're describing contamination as a site of collaboration, and with like Rand's like methodology of anti-smoothness. Yeah, some overlaps. Yeah, because both of you are talking about surface. I mean, Laura, you're talking about surface. Yeah, I mean, through that, sense of like touch, right? So yeah, and also like, yeah, I also wonder like how each of you understand like, haptics, through, yeah, I mean, Laura, you're saying about haptics as like there's so much like hegemony of visuality within anything, right? And I wonder to what extent like the knowledge that is perceived through haptics is again legitimate. I don't know if that question makes sense.
Yeah, I guess I like the openness of it, of interpretation. So the piece, it was different for every single individual that sort of interacted with the installation piece, that when they're sort of touching and they're on the surface, the reading of the changing capacitance that was being picked up would trigger a completely, like, a different response for each visitor, because apparently everyone holds their own unique level of capacitance when interacting.
Yeah.
And it was kind of like that, the way of having, I guess, sound and touch and vibration as this kind of the main focus of how people interacted and understood the concept behind it was an interesting one, because it had a very broad range of feedback and responses. So a lot of the time people were having like a really, immediate, shallow in a way response of like, oh, it's really interesting, I'm touching and I'm getting this change from my own interaction, which I guess, that's kind of where I was going, I guess, from the kind of top level. But then, there was also people sort of engaging a bit more closely with how it was built and sort of the background of the sounds and the sort of traces from the bundle dyeing of these other beings as well. But then, yeah, kind of going back, the main core was this like sound and vibration. So it was interesting going away from that kind of visual focus. However, it's interesting how it does, sometimes people do, they need that kind of additional anchor a lot of the time, so it does help having like a visual reference. So with like the sounds that I was sharing when I did my last exhibit, I sort of did have the kind of reference the beings that the recordings were from, so that was quite interesting, having that kind of connection of like something that's like moss, sort of inanimate, it's alive, but we tend to walk past it. It's just sort of our connection to it isn't one that we have with, I guess, with each other on a human level. Yet when you're sort of listening to these vibrations that come from it, it reveals this whole other perspective that makes you sort of stop and kind of try and interpret in a way what's being communicated there, which is kind of interesting. So yes, I don't know if I answered your question.
No, I think, yeah, no, but like like everyone is free to answer, but sometimes sometimes I grapple with that thing, like, everything is, the way we perceive everything, not just art, right, is visually.
Yeah.
And I wonder, like, through haptics, when we just go to this basic understanding as, you know, reception through touch, I wonder if, like, do you guys see any sort of, like, is the knowledge that is gained through just touch or like, through haptics, like, how do you situate that with the knowledge that one receives through the visual senses? Because I personally find, I feel like you know, the sort of like haptical sort of knowledge becomes a bit more subjective than the visual. I mean, maybe that's where the affect, you know, sort of studies or like, you know, things come into play. But like I wonder if like you, like how you think of like haptics versus any other senses, like, you know, do you see that sort of hierarchy within the senses? And like, you know, I wonder what your each of your positions are with relation to that.
Well, this just made me think about, your question just made me think about like how, you know, when you're making an artwork and then you start putting words next to it, like a title or something, it can just completely change the way you interpret the work. I feel like kind of maybe like the way words can just completely change stuff that you're looking at visually. I think that touching something, or the knowledge of how something feels, or the knowledge of the movements that went into creating something, even if it's like a painting or this, it's really clear how it's been created and the person looking at it knows how it's made or understands the material or has like a prior relationship. I think that changes the way you view the work a lot. I think if you've worked with clay and you look at ceramic work, it's different compared to somebody who's never worked that material, and that's knowledge of how this thing feels and your like body position maybe of what it's like to be making something like that. Or when you see someone making their work or performing, you can kind of empathize what it might feel to be in that position or sit in a certain way or stand in a certain way. I think that it's like a kind of way of understanding things. And I also think it's this tactile touching stuff, like it's potentially, you know, like the future or of where art might be going. I think it might I think in my head, I've thought about this. It could be a thing that haptics is more relevant in the future compared to right now.
So I just want to like follow up your response to the questions, which is you said that there is a difference, like if you have worked with a material, let's say with clay, and then you see a work by another artist who works in, you know, like let's say clay or like ceramics, like the way you receive understand that work is different. So I wonder like reception of work, or let's say like criticism of work, or like art criticism or art theory as developed by artists versus just theorists, you know, or like critics. I wonder like if there is any difference between the way the work is, like, you know, the way the work is understood. I mean, obviously, I guess there is no right or wrong answer, but I just wonder the capacity of artists to generate knowledge, just, you know, of art broadly, like, you know, in a wider capacity, versus just theorists who have never worked with materials. So maybe that's where art practice, PhD or research comes into play.
By the way, I don't know if you asked this question, but I feel like art critics have like they discontextualize you according to whatever movement they think you might be influenced by. Whereas I think that's a really common, like, you know, standard way of doing things, but obviously there's people say different stuff about everything. I don't even think the interpretation of artwork is so Byron.
Thank you, Rand, for taking the time.
Thank you so much. I'm
join
really
us.
sorry I have to leave now.
No
Yeah.
worries at all.
Thank
Good luck
you.
with the the
The
performance.
performances. Yeah. Thank you, guys. Bye.
Bye-bye. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I wonder if like Carolina, you have some response to like, how you understand like working with materials, because you come from a textiles background, right? But you showed the robotic arm. Just wonder like how you understand like haptics through that.
To the world.
I mean, it's just like, just there's no particular question there. I mean, I just like wonder if you could like elaborate more on that.
Yeah, I think
Your understanding of that.
honestly, I think yeah, the tactile effect, the haptic perception is something really strong in textiles. But I think something that helps me a lot to situate textiles in the design building is understand also haptic interface as in technology. You know? It's like how this haptic can be used as an interface to get information, data from people. And I think this is one side that actually critics arts is not really involved, but also I think it's really something that we can discuss. And because textiles in itself, even though, well, at the beginning, as I told you, it was just a really side journey, because where I come from, textile is more connected with activism and arts. But here it's more like a design, architecture, and industry. So it gives me like a huge, a wider sense about what is textiles. And I think in that complex, but also, I don't know, really complex situation, I think I start to understand more the haptic interface in relation with my culture difference. No, that is why I try to mix this reference, like as you say before, like this legitimate, like these big names authors like Jacques Derrida or Roland Barthes, but also mix them with some of the authors that are very strong in the indigenous community, like for example Gamaliel Shurata, no, who is a writer who write a lot about. It's like the Bible from indigenous knowledge, for indigenous people. He wrote that called the El Pez de Oro, and the traduction is like the golden fish. And another one is Elvira Espejo, who is a very well-known weaver. So I think in that sense, it gives me more tools and more glances about how can I mix technology with this different culture from the indigenous knowledge. And I think that I was trying to find this middle ground in order to build something.
I thought it was interesting that you said Derrida was a big name. Like
Yeah.
thinking about the word thing I was saying, like what if you could challenge everything Derrida has ever written by developing a kind of like practice around knowledge gained from this, touching,
Mm-hmm.
and you're kind of, or like understanding the world through touching, you're kind of challenging a lot of what Derrida wrote, which is, that we just understand the world through words and everything is like through language and nothing's outside the text and blah blah blah. Like, yeah, I feel like in a sense, this kind of knowledge, which isn't even from words or maybe things you can describe with words, is kind of challenging that. I don't know, some of the stuff that he said.
Oh yes. I think it's quite a challenge, because that is playing with graphics, no? That actually doesn't mean nothing, but it suggested this kind of language. And it's quite interesting, because when you start to read Derrida, it's actually you don't feel actually these kind of cultures from the colonization, and is all the the global souls, they are not categorized as a written culture. So it's they don't have alphabet. So it's I think put together these two reference is just create something the colonial in itself.
Yeah, exactly. So Dorito was just lying, basically.
Yeah.
He lied to us all. I mean, yeah. But
And we all believed him.
people actually believed him, guys. He got away with it.
I like that idea of haptics as a sort of like decolonial modality. I think that's really interesting. And I mean, I'm not really sure about like if there is like existing like, research. Again, I'm not really just thinking of any particular people, but like wider, research, which has really like explored that much. I mean, I'm really not sure. I'm not sure if any of you guys.
I want to go back to another question you had about like the research, the practice as a site of research. That is what I was doing with unlearning drawing, and I found, just to share some of my findings, like I think that drawing doesn't really happen with your hand. Like that's what I've learned. It happens with your eyes. And if your eyes imagine a line to be a certain way, because of all of the drawings you've seen in your life, then your eyes will try to guide your foot or your hand or your mouth or whatever you're using to draw in that direction of this line that your eyes can remember from seeing another time. So it doesn't really work as a way to decolonize drawing if you already know what drawing is supposed to look like, because you don't really draw with your hands. If I thought the knowledge of the way I draw was in my hands, but it's not in the hand. That's what I'm saying. Or like the hand doesn't really guide it. Does that make sense? Or have I...
No, I
No,
really
that
like
does
it. Yeah,
definitely
that's
make.
very interesting.
Yeah, so I'm kind of still stuck on how I can further deconstruct drawing. I don't think doing it with your eyes closed would be like really good idea, but
You say that. Um, it's really interesting. I think it's that kind of like that feedback, that sensual, like the senses feeding back to our own body, and as you say, like what's been in a way influenced from, is it like our true perspective, or is it like when you're working through like maybe a vibrational feedback, or smell, is that more kind of instinctual, visceral, like a using like the word authentic, but kind of like that it's interesting, like using that as a way to feed back to your brain for information, what the difference is, and if the output has a, not a, I don't know if truthful is the right word, but something, yeah, it'd just be interesting just to kind of compare the two responses in your output in your practice, and trying to explore the other senses as a way to inform where you're going physically, I guess, with the pen or the pencil or the medium you're using, is kind of an interesting thing to explore, I'd say. Yeah.
the other thing is like, I think maybe to consume or absorb artwork that's not like colonized, if you wanted to decolonize your art practice or understanding of drawing, to actually like engage with artwork that's not colonized, and spend the same amount of time or hours or years trying to figure these things out that you have already done with maybe Eurocentric like drawing traditions. That's the other way of it, I guess. Like,
Yeah, it's interesting, that idea of unlearning. like
yeah,
society's needing to unlearn, and how can we engage, like, for next generational like of artists and practitioners, just this kind of, I
well,
guess.
that's what
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
I was
I was.
sorry.
Sorry.
I was just saying that was like, you either have to remove stuff or include other things. I think that's kind of like the two ways we figured out right now, like expand or
It feels like I feel like uncertain when completely know what you're saying, but when you're like, just to like remove information feels like, oh, I don't, but then it's kind of like maybe the order of information, or the accessibility of information is probably maybe a better way, or how it's like shared. So there's like, I guess this is going into like, how we grow up and we learn, and how we learn is an interesting thing, you know, be it through our immediate relationships with each other, or the kind of more society-based relationships and sort of ways of passage that we have to go through, which, you know, does that the influences that
Which
have.
is rooted in visuality, I guess, to an extent,
Yeah.
isn't it?
And
Because I feel like even if you go to an art museum, like it's, you know, like Laura, your work, you know, you because it forefronts haptics, like, right, or like listening, right? But that's not the case with like when you go to a gallery, or you know, just like a normal gallery, you know, like any other gallery, like it's more, even if it's like, even if the work originated, you know, as Najah, your work, which was with drawing by the legs, you know, if it's shown on, like, you know, even if the way of making the work is haptic driven, let's say, it's still received visually. So I really wanted, to what extent, like, you guys think of like curation, or curation as a form in, like, sort of you know, the role curation plays within this whole ecosystem of reception, knowledge creation, dissemination, and what even like the alternative or appropriate way of receiving haptic work is, because you can't just go and, like, you know, touch works on the museum, right? Or, you know, or like forefront that sensorial reception.
Interesting when you get people to, when you're asking them to touch your work and like invite, it's really
And decipher what they get, understand from that work.
and
Well, I feel
yeah,
like if Ran was here, she'd be able to talk about just like seducing the viewer into touching your work by making it super smooth or whatever. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, that's really
it's really
interesting.
interesting. It's kind of like
Yeah.
that, using the visual kind of
Hmm.
seduction to
Yeah, because
Yeah.
you know, I've seen this happen with art that's really like something is painted so well on an object that you feel like this couldn't really be pan painted, and because with really flat paint or something, you put a glaze on, so someone might touch it to see if it's actually painted, like things like that, you know.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Like, again, I guess, you know, just authenticating the legitimacy of the visuality through haptics, I don't know. And
Doesn't culture come back into this? Because we've been taught not
yeah.
to touch artwork in galleries, but my brother is really bad at this because he doesn't really understand that. And he has like caused, I think, every single like British Museum alarm to go off because he keeps touching things. And it's like in the same day, all these alarms are going off. And I'm like, how have you not figured out at this point that you're not supposed to touch this? But it's just so ingrained in like his idea of like, why shouldn't I be able to touch it? It doesn't make any sense. Like that's how he thinks, you know? And so yeah, I think like culture is, it comes into this. Like if you just put up an exhibition in a place where people don't know they're not supposed to touch artwork, surely they're just gonna pick it up and start touching these things if you put them in a room. Right? I mean, I don't know. I think that would happen.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
and that is,
I think
sorry,
since
go on.
no, I was just saying, I think since when I starting my masters, I was always like, how have they done that, or like what is the material here? And I remember like my sense of like, okay, it's there, and I'm like observing, kind of went away because I was more like kind of wanting to like really get under the surface of the materiality of like some of the things that I was looking at, and through that curiosity, I definitely, you know, was getting more like closer to the work, and you know, I think that's really interesting. But it's an interesting way to like, you know, a lot of people are researching the like the idea of what museum means, and like displaying things is an interesting idea of like touching and feeling objects, or works and pieces, or like if you can't, what is the idea behind that, like aside from just trying to protect, I guess, the work itself. But it is so because it's like to preserve it, I guess, and like the value of an object or a piece is, you know, is termed, if it hasn't been, you know, contaminated, I guess, using that word again. But then, is that a good thing? I don't know. Yeah, so it's really interesting.
No, so that's where the preservation, I guess, comes, like preservation of ideologies, possibly.
Mm.
And also, like, I mean, when you think of hegemonic curatorial practices, restricts that sort of knowledge reception through touch. You can't touch.
I mean,
It's just visually.
I've seen people try to counteract this curatorial like scheme, where like I've seen in real life, like someone suggesting while curating artwork, it was textiles work. They said, can we have samples of the textiles available to touch for, as an accessibility thing? And they kind of like say that, oh, you know, for accessibility. And I was really confused what they meant. Like people who are visually impaired, maybe, like, you know, it's an accessibility thing, be able to maybe touch the textiles and experience them in a different way. And I wonder whether that could be a way that this starts, like, to make your work more accessible, especially if it's textile. You could easily like invite that element of having like a touchable sample in a separate place in the exhibition.
Yeah.
I think many times when someone, I saw these kind of activations that happen in the gallery, but sometimes I think I have this perception that it's diminished more as a workshops, not as a proper artwork. And
Yeah.
And when I see them in situation of interaction, they easily work very badly, very bad. Like it's not really the I think it's something in the software that actually is not work very well, but it's as well, it's like has a short life is I have this perception, and it's quite, or maybe it's more for example, in the case in the robotic arm that I did, I was trying to make something also more interactive, but I needed to do like at least 4 or 5 in order that have each that works very well, like constantly, no, like many days, in order to change it. But then I just choose to do the robotic arm in order that choreography, that mimicking this human movement as something similar as happened with the choreography. No, when you see a dance, I don't know, dancing or dancers, you feel this sensation, this immersion when they are dancing, but it's just visually. And I think it's something like this, like this connection between 2 senses or 3 senses, maybe is spatial and temporal, that I want to build it through touch. Yeah,
I think temporality of the senses is like a different thing of its own, I guess.
Has anyone been to the Marina Abramovich show? And are you like forced to touch the performers when you walk through them, or what? I heard about that. You have to squeeze through 2 performers to like get into the space or something. And they're like naked or whatever, and it was like, oh well, you have to like walk through some naked people. But I mean, yeah, you're touching the artist or the art, because the artist is the art performer, whatever.
Yeah.
I think we haven't talked about that. Yeah, people like that.
I think no, I was going to say that it just reminds me of the use of the word interactive within like curation, or in the exhibition of work that involves more than the visuality, I guess. Like you're supposed to interact with it.
But if you have to interact with it. But I mean,
no.
And you have to interact with it because you have to get inside.
Yeah, of course. No, I'm thinking of the usage of such the classification of such art practices in itself is problematic in emphasizing the visual as the main form of knowledge reception or even creation. Because I feel like to some extent, I think all artworks can be, you know, holds possibility to be understood from more than just the haptics, isn't it? I mean, as you know, like Laura, you were going around listening to the micro vibrations, right? So I'm not saying that we should go around like listening to everything around us, but I think, yeah, I mean, and it just makes me think of the knowledge that is sort of not comprehended or uncomprehended or lost through such a, you know, in that sort of hierarchy of the senses.
Yeah, and it's definitely, I guess if one thing for people to take away from feeling and listening to these micro vibrations is just to change their perspective for a moment, just to get them to linger and think about this other experience that we don't normally perceive, that is occurring around us all the time. It's just on a different scale to our existence, so it sometimes feels inaccessible. It doesn't mean it's any less important or real, or you know, that we don't have a relationship with it. We do. It's just how can we, you know, bridge people to that. And I think again, like going to like the sense of smell, like smell is a, I know this is haptics, but smell is really important as well, because it's like it sounds kind of too intimate, but you know, when you're smelling something, you're absorbing particles from that, the thing that you're smell, like the smell is particles, like it's actual matter in a way, from my understanding of it. And so it's quite an intimate exchange that you're having with the world when you can smell things, you know. And then we haven't even mentioned taste. It's a really interesting way. And I think as we are going through this like very very rapid progression through technology, and a lot of people are managing kind of this like loneliness or you know, this disconnection with the world around them, not all the time, but you know, just kind of grappling with that in a way. It is that kind of visual sense that's just like kind of, you know, distracting us, like very quick consumption of like information and entertainment and media. And it's like interesting how actually when you envelop the other senses, it just does, it's something, there's something different there. It's a much more impactful experience. Yeah, so no, it's really interesting how
I fully agree with you, by the way. My favorite artwork ever is something that incorporates like I think all the senses. And you kind of have to walk on these I think it's in like the Jewish History Museum in Berlin, maybe it's still there, but you have to walk on these like masks that are made out of metal. And so like you know, you feel it under your shoes, even if you're wearing like thick boots. You can feel, I mean, obviously it's like rough terrain as well. And then there's this other part of the museum where you're like in a really like long, tall, narrow room. It's quite cold and dark and awkward in there. And I think like they even do something where they don't have the ground like flat, so you feel like a bit dizzy the whole time when you're walking on it. And there's, yeah. So I mean, maybe this is like going into architecture or in that realm, because they think they're not art, but like, but yeah, it is interesting. I think that, you know, if this, it comes also down to like how much like money are we gonna ever have to like make our artwork, and then like how much money would it take to make like so many metal sculptures you could walk on them and a bunch of people could walk in them in the room as well. And this is like a big problem here as well, isn't it? Like
the cost of production, yeah,
cost of production massively, yeah.
and space. But like it's interesting, like yeah, like again going back to smell, it's like how it's quite hard to contain something like smell, and like sound as well is quite invasive in some respects, as you must all know if you've tried to add sound to an installation or exhibit someone else has. It's like there's automatically that kind of collaboration of sounds. But yeah, it's yeah, it's interesting how that the senses, yeah, have this other role that we, you know, I think we are beginning to use it in work though. I think it's definitely something that people are considering. because I think people were just, I guess, in it, as opposed to going through like really digital realm, like with the VR, augmented reality kind of technological outputs that people are now kind of exploring, and it's obviously quite common now to involve that. I feel like people kind of a bit like they want to incorporate this. They feel that everyone is like realizing they're missing this thing, and like there's just this like void. It's really interesting, and like I don't really have a name to it, but I definitely felt that you had this sometimes this void when you're trying to experience something, and there's like something missing when it's just visual. Like, you know, you move through the world and like reality, we don't just use our eyes. It's we're constantly like feeling our weight, you know, and like the surfaces that we're in and moving. So it's yeah.
I feel like it's still like a step above writing though, isn't it? Because like at least I'm not depending on text. Like
no, that's true.
But
hey, I love
also I wanted to say, like, I'm a big hater on Dorita, I think. Maybe that's what I truly am inside. But I used to paint with spices, and I really liked it because it had like this whole smell vibe. But then it just got so like it got so cultural in this really awkward way. Like, I don't really want people to like see this and think, okay, this is like a brown girl who's painting with spices. Like, does she smell like, I don't know, this kind of whole thing. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
no, I didn't even think about. But then I was like, oh no,
turn yourself into like a stereotype of the South Asian artist. I just really didn't want to do that. I was like, fuck this. I can't.
at all. Yeah, no, that's oh well. That aside, that sounds really cool. Like that's great. But yeah, no. Yeah, no, it's really it's just kind of like, I guess it's interesting, like just I guess a lot what all of us have done in a way is sort of looked at I guess our initial practice or kind of focus of outputs, and we've felt that we've needed to expand out, and we've used these other methods, and we're still experimenting and learning, but I think that's what gets us excited, and we're finding that kind of joy and challenge as well. And I think, you know, in all of the ways that everyone seems to have been progressing their outputs is really exciting. So it's just kind of like, let's keep it going.
I think that's sorry, go on.
No, it's just something that actually I think maybe briefly you mentioned. It's about when you talk about the smelling, this kind of temporality about the senses. I think that this is another huge challenge, no? Because I think the visuality has this, and when we use the VR, we can come back and use it, and it's there, but the touch is something actually that just keep in the memory. At the smelling, and when we smell is something that actually is not occupy any space, it's just in ourselves.
Yeah.
And how we can do this kind of sensorial register through our practice. And I think this is a lovely challenge that I just start to think about that.
I think that's such an amazing way to close this forum also. I mean, because you know it's 3, right? 2 hours is up. And I find that really interesting. And also, like, as you said, Carolina, like the sensorial registers, and I find so much potential in them as sites of knowledge production, and like, you know, new ways of thinking about things, you know. Yeah, along with, you know, incorporating it within practice, but also in those, the capacities of these registers to like add on to create knowledge of their own. Najah, you wanted to say something?
I'm really skeptical of smells not lasting. I just think some things are so stinky. If you ever put like henna in a room, that is so pungent. It is such a pungent smell, and it's not very expensive to get henna. Other stuff as well. Like, there are some things that have a really strong smell, and I don't think it would be. I think it'd be fairly affordable and possible to make work that's centered around the smell of something. Yeah, I don't think it's so. Maybe if it's happening in like the turbine hall, no, but if it's in like a normal art space, I'm sure it's fine.
Yeah.
But they did do that in the Turbine Hall. I think they had these things releasing perfume
That rings
once. They did.
uh,
It
Yeah.
was recent. So.
Yeah, I remember like in 2022, last year, like from CAP, we went to see the show at the Turbine Hall, and it had, I forgot the name of the artist, but it had like scents.
Anika ji?
But then like, sorry?
Anika ji?
Yeah, I
Is that?
think, yeah.
Yeah, Anika ji.
Yeah, the floating
Exactly, the
installation.
floating
Oh
aerobic.
yeah, those jellyfish
Turban
things.
hall. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then like I think the issue of the census also like, was problematized because of like COVID and like health, where the visuality was the more safe, and
Yeah, but that's that. I mean, if it come like which one's more temporal? I think definitely COVID. We're moving past that now. Like, I don't think that's going to be a problem in the future. And I think people are going to do the opposite of challenging the restrictions that COVID put on us. Yeah, I think that could be something that people do.
And I think that is also important, like now that we are moving past that, to fall back on that, or like even like amplify those registers.
I'm
So
honestly like, if I have to be super honest and blunt, like I'm really tired of like seeing the trend in COVID, like of Instagrammable artwork becoming so popular, like work that looks really cool on online platform is taken over. And I'm really waiting for this trend to die down, because I've seen so many of these works in real life and I was really disappointed. But they were designed in a way where you're supposed to view them online, So I don't know. This is a feeling that I've had towards the art world recently, that I don't know if you guys would share that, but I can be quite negative sometimes.
no, I mean, I was actually like thinking how in so many ways like art practice in the age of social media, like with TikTok and Instagram, of course, like how art practice has tremendously shape shifted itself to fit, to be like it should look good on Instagram, or if I can encompass my whole art practice or the making of my work into TikTok. I find that really interesting because I think it completely changes the way practice is practiced for its reception, like with social media. So I think that's really interesting. I mean, I'm seeing some small uh, changes in that, because I mean, right now artists need to be on Instagram, right? They need to be posting stuff. Otherwise, I mean, it is good to be on Instagram because that has more reach.
Is it why you like spokesperson for Instagram? Social media is
Me,
great. Yeah.
I am. This session is actually sponsored by Instagram. Great promotion.
No, it's good. It's good to have your work accessible to audiences, but my foot drawings look so different in real life. It doesn't look anything like what it does online.
Which actually like really interests me, because if your works were on Instagram, like, right, I'm seeing as at a picture, I might just think you drew it by hand. But then I really wonder like how the reception would be if someone told the viewer, oh, it's actually drawn by the foot. So I think it's really interesting. I think it completely like changes the way the work is received. And I really find that how sort of disclosing that information in itself completely or like telling the information that the drawing was done by hand completely flips the way that the work is viewed and received. I don't know
Yeah.
if that's something that you have thought about or
Oh yeah, of course.
experienced.
I
Yeah.
always had this idea of showing the drawings alongside me performing making them. So you can see how I'm making them while you're looking at the finished works, just so that I don't have to necessarily communicate this. But I feel like, yes, in real life, I think you're more likely to notice if something was drawn by someone's foot, because it might say that right next to the work, which would completely change the way. But on Instagram, you might just be flicking through things or stories, and you might not be reading all of that information. Yeah, you spend even less time looking at work on Instagram. I think it's like 6 seconds in a gallery. I think it might even be like half a second on Instagram to look at work.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. I've got so many. I'm so irritated by the dependency on social media. I don't like it. I think people need to see the work in real life and just engage with actual art culture and people and artists and meet them and talk to them.
Agreed.
Yeah, so
It's very important, but yeah, the best conversations happen in person, and when you're actually making a person-to-person interaction is always the best.
it's funny how you're talking about that and doing it
We're
virtually.
doing a Zoom.
This is so much more than what you'd get on Instagram, isn't it? This isn't like a caption that we all wrote just to look at together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like the closest you can get to real life.
Yeah, so I think I'm really aware of the time, so I think we should bring the forum to the close. I think it's really amazing how we sort of like what you're talking about. I think it's an amazing thing to think about, right? And what I really find interesting about these forums is that, like, even though we are like convening on like specific themes, I feel like there's definitely an overlap, and I think that's really exciting to see how that is informing the way the discussions happen in the next forum. So with that, like, if any of you want to be participants or speakers in the next forum, please feel free to, all of you are welcome, more than welcome. So please feel free to like let me know, and we can arrange that. All right. So I just also want to say thank you to each one of you for taking the time to make yourself free and contribute. Also to Ran, who is not here. I'm aware that she had a performance. She's having her solo show, so she's having a performance now. And yeah, and Carolina, you have a show coming up in Peru.
Yes, I am in the middle of the production.
Amazing.
Very exciting.
Yes.
When
Really,
is the show opening?
when is 18th?
18th. Exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm excited to see the pictures on Instagram.
Oh, thank you. I will share with you guys. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Tony,
and
for making this space as well. Like, thanks for inviting me. And well, I mean, I invited myself, but also, yeah. I hope you guys enjoy my presentation. I think I could have done better with time management because I missed out so many things I wanted to say. But yeah, 10 minutes seems like a long time until you actually do it.
Yeah, it's no
yeah,
time.
I mean, it's tricky when it comes to time. And in the first forum, like, it completely, it like went like way beyond the time. But I think that's why, like, just fixing on one small thing, like one particular aspect within your work, because I feel like the discourse takes time, I feel.
No, I don't have a problem with the way you set it up. I just think that I should have done a better job practicing saying everything faster, maybe.
No. No, of course. I mean, that's what, like, you're free to come in the next forum,
Just continuing on my last point, guys. Like, I didn't
Yes.
actually finish, but
Yeah, of course. And Laura, I know you had a show at VNA, very exciting. Unfortunately couldn't attend.
No, it's all right. Don't worry. Don't worry. I'll share some photos.
Yeah.
Really nice. We were
Yeah, like,
there's a little group of us from our program that got selected as part of the digital design weekend, and I was thinking, like, I think mine was like the least digital. It was like, which was interesting to think
yeah.
about. But yeah, no, it's exciting.
Yeah. Anyway,
Good to
just want to
hear
bring it
it.
up. Thank you to each one of you, and I hope you have a great day. And I'll see you in the next forum.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.